Stay tuned. If you believe in subtle beings, if you believe in karma, if you believe in a spiritual world, I got to tell you, just imagine the kind of support you get when you work on an issue like this. I think there's like the spirit of every mammal, every plant, bacteria, fungus, they're all on our side. So when we get the energy to protect the earth against GMOs, maybe it's my imagination, but it feels like the wind is blowing so powerfully at our backs, and all we have to do is raise the sail, and we end up just propelled forward, and all this coincidence and synchronicity happens around us. And that is accelerating. I came out of a meeting with an organization that had 16 million members, and it was all yeses. Got a call from someone, they wanted me to meet, and it was all yeses. And I just got this feeling, this was earlier this year, that this is the time of great grace for this particular movement. And it feels, I see that everywhere. I see it in the over 100 events this month, most of them on Sunday. Rallies like today all over the country, 7 in Florida. I mean, people want to get out now and speak about this. So when I honor Les, I honor someone who's like woken up into this stream, like he put his sail out there and is like, whoa, can hardly keep contained. It's really a fantastic experience to work on GMOs, especially now, because there's so much receptivity, all our actions are highly leveraged. I also want to thank Marlene. Marlene, where are you? Thank you. Marlene's was the reason I was able to be here. I was invited to speak to Food Med today, and so I wanted to figure out how I can afford to come up and stay, and Marlene's just stepped in and said, we'll put you up, we'll give you an audience, we'll take care of you, and thank you for taking care of me. That was magnificent. And also, Dan, I understand Bastir, the whole focus, the whole help in this last minute, the food, wasn't that food fantastic? Amazing. Now, Bastir is a college for naturopaths, right? And I spoke at the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians in August in Phoenix. And I had spoken in 2006. And I got to tell you, this group is so enthusiastic about stopping GMOs. And each doctor sees 1,000 to 2,000 patients. And so when you get a doctor who's prescribing non-GMO diets to every patient, that's huge. And some of the doctors were coming up to me in the conference saying, I heard you speak in Portland in 2006, and I got your shopping guides, and I get your newsletter, and I'm handing everything out, and I've got all my patients eating non-GMO. And I never talked to these people. I never heard about these people. I had no idea that they were turned on, completely turned on the GMO issue. But I had seen this over and over and over again. Went to a doctor in Chicago. She said to me at an American Academy of Environmental Medicine conference, every one of my patients get prescribed non-GMO diets and everyone gets better. I said, can you say that again? She said, 100%. They all start to get better with non-GMO diets. I said, can I come and interview you in Chicago and interview your patients? She goes, sure. So I go up there with a camera crew and speak to 7 or 8 of her patients, and skin problems, overweight, irritable bowel, migraine, all sorts of things. Now we interviewed the patients on the details of the changes. And then It brought in some cofactors. They switched to organic in order to avoid GMOs. They stopped eating processed foods as much as possible. Some cut out gluten and dairy. So like, where's the cause? I mean, some people were getting better in 2 or 3 days from things that their doctors, the previous doctors, were saying they'd have to live with. But in the same week, I talked to some veterinarians who had a much cleaner experiment. They took livestock off GMOs, fed them the same soy and corn, but the soy and corn was non-GMO. And the death rate went down, the stillborn rate went down, the litter size went up, the health went up. I talked to one farmer. He had the same experience. He said, you can just see in the pig's eyes, they're healthier. They're not blood. I mean, he's like going on about how happy he was about his hogs and his pigs as being delicious and, well, not delicious. That was another thing. But speaking of delicious, he actually does his own butchering, and he butchers both for his own personal use, and he butchers those that are fed GM and those that are fed non-GM. And he said, those that are fed GM, they're discolored organs, and it was a huge stench, horrible. Those who were fed the non-GM, it was all white, and it smelled fresh. Now, I can't relate to that, but nonetheless, he was just so excited. He said, my wife refuses to feed the kids any animal products that have been fed GMOs because she sees the difference in the lard. Her lard, for non-GM was white, the other was yellow, discolored. I talked to a veterinarian I said, have you noticed any difference in livestock from when GMOs were introduced? He said, oh yeah, inflammation. Talked to another veterinarian. Oh yeah, the whole gastrointestinal disorders. Another veterinarian who deals with pets, he said, oh yeah, allergies. A surgical veterinarian came up to me last night after talking at Marlene. She said, you're missing an area. There's so many allergies among pets now. And this first veterinarian says, when people write him about problems, because he's a syndicated columnist and author, and they have itching, he says, switch to organic, the itching goes away. So I said to this Chicago doctor, after interviewing her patients, I said, where did you hear about this? She goes, from you. And it was like, I had no idea. She had attended one of my talks at the American Academy of Environmental Medicine, never had any contact with her, never met her. And she was like this absolute, enthusiastic, zealous, non-GMO practitioner. And I started seeing this level of knowledge and commitment all over the United States, starting in 2010, where a store owner from Washington State somewhere, I don't remember where, we interviewed him at, I was here for the Natural Products Association conference. And he started talking about GMOs and talking about the details and talking about such incredible details of the health dangers, and more articulate than I am. Just going on, and his face was red and he was quite... I said, where did you hear about this? He says, well, I run a health food store, and I saw a video online or somewhere, and I got real excited, and I came back to the store the next day, and I looked at this blue non-GMO education center, and I realized we had the video, and we had this book, so I watched that video, and I watched that video, and I read that book, and he had read every book twice, and seen every video at least twice, and it was like his life's work to stop people from eating GMOs. You can't step in his store and be a GMO eater when you step out. And he was talking to me, and there was a woman who runs a group of moms and dads of autistic kids. And every one of them are off GMOs. And she says, BT toxins, she thinks that's the reason, and quoting the studies and doing her own research. So in 2010, I'm like confronted with these absolute, excited, knowledgeable people. And I thought to myself, this is the sign of the coming tipping point. This is a greater sign than the fact that in 2009, the American Academy of Environmental Medicine said all doctors should prescribe non-GMO diets to every patient because the animal feeding studies show reproductive problems, immune system problems, accelerated aging, organ damage, etc. It was a bigger sign than the fact that 2009 it was GMO-free was the fastest growing label claim in store brands in America. And it's the third fastest growing label claim in all products sold in grocery stores today, and the fastest growing claim in the natural food industry. It was a bigger sign than supermarket news predicting that GMOs would have an unprecedented upsurge of consumer awareness and concern for 2010. I was seeing it in people, and I knew that these people, our friends all over the country, were going to create the tipping point. And the tipping point is not theoretical. How many people have heard me speak before? How many people have never really spent time studying the health or hearing about the health dangers of GMOs? Raise your hand, please. Very few. I'm not going to give my normal talk, by the way, about the health dangers. You can catch that online on our website for free. It's called Everything You Have to Know About Dangerous Genetically Modified Foods. But Les asked me to speak about how to live a non-GMO lifestyle, how to choose, how to make it integrated into our lives. So I'm going to take that time. I want to remind you of the tipping point before we go into that discussion. In 1999, the biotech industry predicted that within 5 years they'd have 95% of all commercial seeds genetically engineered. That was in January. In February, the gag order was lifted on a scientist who had discovered that GMOs were very, very dangerous. 10 weeks later, nearly all food companies in Europe committed to stop using GM ingredients in Europe. Because the coverage on the gag order lifted and all that story made GMOs a marketing liability in Europe. It just went like that. From a plan to take over nature, to replace nature with GMOs in 5 years, to eliminating GMOs from a continent, except for animal feed. Just like that. In 10 weeks, the tipping point was achieved. Bovine growth hormone. It's banned in Canada, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and now Walmart's milk, and Starbucks milk, and Yoplait and Dannon's yogurt. Again, a tipping point, not as quick as the 10 weeks in Europe. Took a little longer. But it was the same concept. It became a marketing liability because consumers learned about the health dangers. Our campaign for eliminating GMOs is designed to motivate 5% of US shoppers to avoid GM ingredients and to buy brands that are non-GMO listed on our shopping guide. 5% we think would be enough to show a drop in market share to the same major companies that have already removed GMOs in Europe and Japan, like Kraft, and they'll take it out of the United States markets if they think it's gaining traction. And we don't think that's a difficult thing to do. And the way we do it is we teach people why to avoid GMOs, and we can convince people to avoid GMOs in about 10 minutes. I had a meeting today at FoodMed with people that make purchases for health care institutions. I had them, as I normally do, have them rate themselves from 1 to 100, how vigilant they've been at avoiding GMOs. And most people were low vigilance after 40 minutes. All but one was in the highest category, 80 to 100. Same thing with doctors, same thing with the general public. It's easy to get people to switch to non-GMO by telling them the truth. And I could spend 40 minutes, but some of you have heard that, and I don't want to do that tonight. So bookmark this in your mind. Go to responsibletechnology.org, go to the resource tab, go down to the videos, and the first video should be that 84-minute talk. So it's easy to get people to stop eating GMOs, or to want to stop eating GMOs. So now we're going to talk about how. That's the second thing. So there's 3 pieces of our message. And we think these 3 pillars are sufficient to create the tipping point if we get it out to enough people. Why avoid GMOs? And that's primarily the health dangers, and you also have to discredit those that say GMOs are safe, like Monsanto and the FDA, and that's easy. 2, how to avoid GMOs. And 3, how to stop GMOs. And we'll talk more about that at the end, which gives you opportunities to take action here and nationally. And it becomes so easy when you think about how we put it together. It's so easy now. I think it's going to happen by the end of next year, where we'll see the tipping point in the United States. But yeah, let's get that please. So how to avoid GMOs? Now, first of all, people have to choose restrictions that work for them. And no matter what restrictions you choose, you may end up inadvertently having to eat GMOs. So let's first deal with that. I recommend that if you end up eating GMOs, don't worry about it. Because worrying is toxic, and GMOs are toxic, and then you have two toxins to worry about. I would say consciously decide not to worry about it. When I was at the American Association of Naturopathic Physicians, I asked someone, okay, what's the vegetable oils that are cooked, or what are the oils cooked on this thing? And they told me the exact opposite information. And so I ate, the only thing I ate to speak to the chef was the fried plantain. And he comes out and says, oh, no, that's cooked in canola oil. I went, okay. I didn't go, oh God, canola oil, what do I do to purge myself? No, I go, okay. You got to just deal with it. So I deal with it by not worrying about it at all. So I take all the precautions to avoid it, and if I can't avoid it, I don't worry about it. In fact, I consciously choose not to have this quiet nagging like, oh, you're saying you're not going to worry about it, but you really did it. No, I just say, okay, fine. Because I'm doing this to be healthy, right? And this is a healthy attitude too. You do what you can, and if something goes wrong, you do what you can. So spontaneous and immediate forgiveness of the situation. It took a little bit longer to forgive the guy that gave me the wrong information. But I got to him already, eventually. So that's one thing. Second, how important is it to avoid all GMOs? You have these different classes. Now, the more you process something, the lower the risk. One of the great yuck factors for GMOs is that the only human feeding study showed that the genes inserted into soybeans so that the soy would be Roundup ready, not killable with Roundup herbicide, part of that gene transferred to the DNA of bacteria living inside our intestines, along with the promoter, which is the piece of genetic material that turns on the gene. And this bacteria that had the DNA integrated into had the gene integrated into its DNA, was not dying in the presence of Roundup's active ingredient, glyphosate. In other words, it was Roundup-ready gut bacteria, suggesting that not only did the gene transfer from soybeans into our gut bacteria, but that it continued to function, producing these genes, these proteins, which actually have a similar section to a known allergen, dust mite allergen. So if you're allergic to dust, you might be allergic to this protein produced continuously inside your digestive tract. So it's a horrible thought, especially when you think of the genes that produce the Bt toxin, which is the insecticide that breaks open the stomach of insects and kills them, that might transfer to your gut bacteria and turn it into living pesticide factories. So I would say that's a pretty bad thought. As bad thoughts go, that's one of them. You know, you look up bad thought in the dictionary, it said Bt genes in your gut. So there. So it's good to know that some of the highly processed foods don't have DNA and don't have protein. So the Bt toxin is a protein. The gene that produces it is DNA. And if you get to the highly refined oil stage, it has neither or very low amounts. If you get to high fructose corn syrup, it is gone. All those very processed foods from corn that are at the end of this 3-day wet mill process, they will not have DNA and they will not have protein. Now, if you write companies, they'll tell you, oh, don't worry, our soy products or our corn products, they have no DNA and no protein. There's no GMO material in there. So it's safe. It's just as safe as if it were regular corn and regular soy or whatever. Well, this is a lie. I mean, some people believe it, but it's not true. There is a risk associated with these highly refined materials. But the risk is not gene transfer, and it's not an active Bt toxin. It's something else. But it's less because it doesn't have the Bt toxin and it doesn't have the DNA. It is not as risky as eating the corn on the cob that produces the Bt. And Monsanto is about to introduce corn on the cob that has not only 2 Bt genes in it, but also a Roundup Ready gene. So the corn will actually have gobs and gobs of Roundup herbicide, which is linked to cancer, birth defects, endocrine disruption, placental cell deaths, etc. But you won't necessarily. But what about the final product of this corn process? Well, at the time when you genetically engineer something, you create massive collateral damage. You can have hundreds of, even 1,000 different genes changing their levels of expression, and that can change all these different metabolic pathways. You can produce all sorts of things like a fat-soluble toxin, which will end up in the oil. It's not the DNA, it's not the protein, it's something else that ends up in the oil, maybe, or in the high fructose corn syrup. In fact, there was a study that I refer to in my book, Genetic Roulette, where they found that corn was creating this really intense endocrine disruptor, which was interfering with the fertility of mice, causing them to be infertile, and they could not destroy this hormone, this endocrine disruptor, in very, very high temperatures. So they said it's probably there in corn oil. That's an example. But no one has done the research. So it's a gamble. It's also less of a problem, generally, if there's less content. So if you have a tiny amount of corn syrup, corn oil, soy lecithin, then you should have a lower risk than eating corn on the cob or polenta or a bowl of corn chips or things like that. Now I say this, but I have no idea what level is safe. This is a background to you. Everyone's going to determine what's comfortable for you and what's practical for you. These are the considerations before I give you the actual practical steps of how to avoid. So Starlink corn was supposedly not approved for the human food supply. It was found in the human food supply. It was a genetically engineered corn to produce this Bt toxin. And when they found it in the human food supply, they asked the top allergists in America, who were the scientific advisory panel for the EPA. Adventis was freaking out. It was going to be $1 billion problem. Said, can you give us an amount that would be safe? Because it's only there in tiny amounts. It was only planted to less than 1% of the acreage in the US. It's only there in tiny amounts. Give us a break. And they said no. It's a medium likelihood of being an allergen, and there's not any level that can be considered safe. Because allergens can cause allergic reactions in tiny amounts. L-tryptophan was genetically engineered, 1984 to 1989, and Showa-Denko KK, a corporation in Japan. And the genetic engineering process almost certainly created the contaminants that killed about 100 Americans and caused 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick or become permanently disabled. The pills passed the US pharmaceutical standard for purity. The 5 or 6 contaminants that they found ranged between 0.1% and 0.01%. I say this because you can't say that something is too small to be not a problem. But the smaller it is, the less of a problem it should be, in most cases. So you think about sugar, that from sugar beets, most of the sugar in the United States is from sugar beets. It's over 99% pure. It's dextrose. What's the remaining portion? Is it possible that it contains a problem from GMOs? There's an example of a pretty pure substance that may be completely safe. The sugar beet pulp that's fed to animals is probably very unsafe because they had to get an increase of an allowable herbicide residues for Roundup by about 5,000% in order to get the Roundup ready sugar beets approved. So the animals, the horses and others that eat the sugar beet pulp are probably suffering significantly. So we eat sugar from sugar beets, if it doesn't say pure cane sugar, and it's just 99.4% pure. I don't know exactly the number. And we don't know if the dextrose is different, if the molecule is exactly the same. No idea. I'm not a chemist, and no one has checked. So that's the background. You've got the different levels. You've got the actual fresh corn, the papaya from Hawaii that's genetically engineered to produce viral proteins to protect it against a virus. You know, that's right there, fresh. You get all, whatever the problem is, it's all there and in high concentrations. So you have to decide what's your comfort level. Another example is meat. Meat can be fed from animals fed GM crops. Now, the FDA, the secret documents made public from a lawsuit, revealed a lot of things. That the FDA was freaking out about GMOs, that they thought it was unsafe, that they tried to get their superiors to not approve it, but to test it in detail, and that was completely overruled by Monsanto's former attorney, who was in charge of policy at the FDA. But one of the secret documents was the director of the Center for Veterinary Medicine, Gerald Geist, who said that there's unique health problems in the milk and meat from animals fed GMOs. And anyone who knows the biology understands that when you send things through a cow, the cow can bioaccumulate toxins. So if there's toxins in the food, maybe the toxins can lodge in the fat of the cow and accumulate and accumulate. It's like the mercury in fish. Like the larger the fish, the worse it is. Well, here you're just pouring so much corn and soy that's genetically engineered into these animals, you might end up with some real problem.